Hello and welcome back to the course Private Pilot Maneuvers. Now last time we discussed engine failures on or after takeoff. And this time we'll talk about engine failure during cruise. As usual, I'm only referring to single-engine airplanes now. It's a different story with multi-engine airplanes, of course. But basic training airplanes are always single-engine planes. So an engine failure where it's not possible to restart the engine always ends in a forced landing. And we'll also focus on the forced landing procedure. Now in this briefing, not so much on the engine restart procedure. You should simply read the pilot's operating handbook to know it. And normally in the pilot's operating handbook, there's also a procedure not only for the engine restart, but then also how to actually do the forced landing. For example, in the Cessna 152 handbook, it says that on final approach, you should fly a speed of 60 knots with the flaps down. And you should pull the mixture to idle cutoff, switch off the fuel valve and the ignition. And after you have extended your flaps, also switch off the master switch and unlatch the doors before touchdown. Now this all serves the purpose of reducing the chance of fire after landing, and unlatching the doors should prevent that you get trapped in the airplane if the doors should get jammed during, for example, a crash landing. Alright, now there are quite some general steps that are commonly used in most single-engine airplanes in the event of an engine failure. And the first thing to do always is to fly your best glide speed. So first step after the engine failure should be to reduce your speed to best glide speed. In a Cessna 152, it's 60 knots. In some bigger airplanes, it can be different according to weight, so you may have different speeds. However, the gliding ratio will still stay the same. So reduce to your best glide speed. It will give you the maximum gliding distance, so the most options. And then trim for that speed. And when that is out of the way, you should turn towards your desired landing area. Now, if you start looking for a suitable field, at that point, it's pretty late actually. It's always best if you do that proactively during normal cruise flight when the engine is running happily. You should always take a look outside and look for suitable fields so that in the event of an engine failure, you have them at your disposal right away and you immediately know I need to turn left or right, or maybe the ideal field is just behind me. This is something that you wouldn't know if you start looking just after the engine failure. And then really judging a field precisely is difficult from high altitude. You often won't be able to do that correctly. So it's the best idea to initially, if you're at a higher altitude, to just turn to the generally most suitably looking area. And then, you can be concerned about the details a bit later on when you can better see all the obstacles and so on in that area, and then pick your specific field. If you're already in the area of your field, so it's right below you, for example, then just stay in this area. Like you can see in the image, spiral over the landing field. Don't fly too far away from it. Of course, with an engine failure, forced landing, you only have one go. So unlike in a precautionary landing, so you need to judge. You don't have that much time to judge your actual landing field if it's suitable. And when you have made your decision, and at the very last moment you see that the field is not suitable, of course it can be difficult to pick a new field in time, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, if you are high enough, so let's say you're at 8,000 feet, so there's no real rush, then of course you can try to restart the engine. Now, engine failures in basic training aircraft with normally aspirated piston engines, well, can only be caused by two things actually, that's fuel or ignition. So all the restart procedures in the handbooks normally deal with fuel and ignition. So in the Cessna 152, for example, it says, okay, first fly the best glide speed of 60 knots, switch on the carb heat, make sure that the primer is locked, make sure that the fuel is actually set to on, the fuel valve, and that the mixture is rich, and that the ignition is on both, or if the propeller has already stopped, that you switch the ignition to start to try to restart the engine. Now, if that doesn't help right away, it's probably not going to work, and you should early enough stop, try to restart the engine, and really concentrate on the landing. If there's still some time left, of course, you can do a mayday call to alert ATC or other airplanes on the frequency, and then you should secure the cabin if time permits, so stow all loose objects, check your seatbelts again, and so on. Then what I suggest is to fly a normal traffic pattern, because this is how you do it in normal operations, so you will have a good feeling of the airplane and of gliding distance out of a normal pattern. So from your spiraling pattern overhead the field, you should enter a pattern. Normally it's the downwind, and then you can adjust this pattern according to your actual altitude. Also, of course, you have to keep in mind the wind. So if on final approach you would have a strong headwind, you need to turn base earlier. Otherwise, just extend the downwind a little bit so you can really adjust the pattern to suit your needs. And of course, it's a good idea to plan the approach a little bit higher, so to err on the high side rather than on the low side. Because if you're getting too low with no excess speed, there's no way to salvage the situation. You then have to pick another field or simply take what's there. But if you're coming in a little bit too high, you can get rid of that excessive altitude by, for example, performing a slip or S-turns, anything that helps you lose altitude. Also, flaps, so don't extend full flaps right away. If you notice that you're coming in too high, you can then extend the flaps to a bigger setting or full flaps right away, and then you will also descend quicker, of course. This is something that can be practiced pretty easily, so you should do that once in a while you're in a normal traffic pattern. Just pull the power pack to idle and then try to land at your desired touchdown spot on the runway without the help of any power. That's a very important exercise actually, because it gives you a good feeling of the gliding distance of the airplane in different configurations, and this will come in very handy when you have an actual engine failure. Also, you should know your glide ratio. For example, if you have on your GPS, you have a nearest airfield popping up 5 miles away, and you're at 5,000 feet. It's of course helpful if you know if you can make this distance or not. So there is no explicit number in the pilot's operating handbook of the Cessna 152, like for example 1 to 12 gliding ratio, but there's a chart from which I have extracted the gliding ratio to be roughly 1 to 9. This means for 1,000 feet of altitude loss, you will be able to travel 9,000 feet, which is more or less 1.5 miles. Many small airplanes have different gliding ratios, so 1.5 miles for 1,000 feet of altitude, that's pretty common. Just keep in mind that if you are flying into a headwind, then this distance will be less, and with a tailwind it will be increased. But this should help you at a glance decide whether, for example, you can make that airstrip that is 4 miles away. And if you see that you won't be able to make it, then you just concentrate on a field that's nearby. It's much safer than trying to stretch the glide to an airfield that you cannot reach in the first place. The gliding distance, of course, is also influenced by your flap setting, for example. So this is only valid for flaps up and a windmilling propeller. Now, a windmilling propeller creates more drag, of course, than a propeller that has already stopped. But the gliding ratio given in the handbook is based on a windmilling propeller, so the worst case, so to speak. So the field selection for a forced landing, of course, is very important, and it's also pretty difficult. At first, as I said, you should turn towards that general area where it seems most suitable for an off-airport landing. And then when you get closer, you should examine the area more closely and then pick your desired landing spot. It can be difficult to see quite a lot of obstacles from higher altitude. That's especially true for wires, for example. Telephone lines, power lines, they can often be seen only very late. So don't look for the wires, look for the poles and the masts, because they will give away the location of the wires more clearly. Now, so when you have chosen your field, it might happen that on closer examination you notice that it's not really that suitable. So don't be afraid to change your mind then and pick another field on short notice if that looks better. Just don't do it too often and don't do it very late because changing your plans really, really late, so on very final approach, can be pretty hazardous as well, because sometimes it's better to have a really controlled landing, even controlled crash landing on unsuitable terrain than an uncontrolled crash on a really nice field. Of course, always keep in mind the wind and the obstacle situation. If you can, of course, land into the wind, but be careful if you have any significant obstacles at the beginning of your field, because then if you come in too low, then you will hit those obstacles at flying speed. So sometimes it can be better to pick a field, even if it's downwind, that has no obstacles before it, but maybe some obstacles at the far end, because it's better to crash into them at a very slow speed than still at flying speed. There are many different types of terrain, of course, and also of fields. Of course, an ideal field is flat, it's long enough, there is only little or very well short vegetation. A surface that's as hard as possible, of course, and as flat as possible is perfect. For example, a mowed grass or well, fields under certain conditions. That is something that you try out in the airplane best. So just if during a normal flight, just always take a look down, look what fields look most suitable, and during training let your instructor point out which fields would be best in the given situations. Generally, to pick a landing field, you have to keep in mind the 5 S's: size, shape, surface, slope, and surroundings. So size, obviously, it should be long enough. The same with shape. Also, shape also means terrain in some way. Slope, of course, it's better to land uphill than downhill. The surface, well, that speaks for itself. And also the surroundings in terms of obstacles. An alternative can be to land, if there's no suitable terrain at all, is to pick a river for an emergency forced landing, or just a river bed. Especially in mountainous terrain where maybe you have no other option. Also a road, of course, can be a good alternative because it's flat and it's paved surface. However, of course, there's one problem, that's traffic. So only pick a road if there's no traffic at all. And be aware that often alongside roads there are power lines, telephone lines, any man-made structures that you may only be able to see very late. You can also choose fields with some vegetation on it. For example, cornfields can be quite nice actually, because they will quickly dissipate your energy. So you will stop pretty quickly and you will have a rather soft way of reducing your speed and getting the airplane to a stop. Also will kind of cushion the landing and absorb a bit of the energy, which so it can be a really good option actually to land in a wheat field, for example. But of course, it would be even more advisable to have a flat surface. Same goes for trees. Well, if you really must, you can also do your forced landing into a forest, for example, so into trees. It's just important then that you do it at a slow speed with the nose up, that you regard the treetop level as your actual landing surface and do a normal slow landing into there. It's of course much better if you have closely spaced trees that are rather short. It's preferable then you have very tall trees maybe standing farther apart, because then you will probably fall from a high altitude pretty far to the ground, which of course is very hazardous. Then there might be the need to ditch the airplane. So if you're flying over water, you're unable to reach land. Well, then you might have to ditch the airplane in the water, but this exceeds the scope of this course. I could talk for hours about ditching. So just keep in mind that there's a danger of ditching if you fly farther away than your gliding distance from the shore or any usable landing area at the shore, that is actually. Now, if you can only choose a field where the impact with an obstacle will be inevitable, then you should keep in mind that avoiding crash injuries is first of all a matter of keeping the vital structure intact, and that would be the cabin, because there you and your passengers are sitting. And you do that by using dispensable structure, like the engine cowling, for example, the landing gear, or the bottom structure of the airplane. It's like in a car, it's normally better at a given speed to hit an object straight on, so you have all the engine and all those structures before you, so you have more structure that will absorb the energy than, for example, if you have a side-on collision into the door of the car, where there is much less absorbing structure available. And the second thing that's important in order to avoid or reduce injuries is to avoid bodily contact with the structure. And this normally involves having a good seating position and your seatbelt fastened tightly and correctly. Speed is also, of course, also important. It's always better to hit an object with a slower speed than to hit it fast. And as I've said before, you can also use, for example, vegetation as this dispensable structure. So, for example, a cornfield or something like that. Always try to land at your forced landing area in the right attitude, rather slow with the nose up. Don't come in too fast with a 3-point landing or even nose wheel first, because then the nose wheel might dig in and it will collapse, or you might have a rollover. Also, try to avoid steep bank angles close to the ground. So set up your approach in a way that you don't need those, because then, of course, the stall speed is much higher. There's a risk of stalling the airplane, and there's also a risk of a wingtip strike. So those are some basics about forced landings. Fortunately, in the simulator, we can perform this very safely, completely safely, actually. So I'd say let's try it out. I'll meet you in the airplane.